All right, we're here today on Rogue News on a very special broadcast, which is a bit of a hybrid between the Canadian Patriot podcast and Rogue News. CJ, that's an excellent intro you just did. Whitney, we are so honored to have you here joining us. We have a live audience as well, as far as I could tell. They will be posing some questions. V really wanted to be here, but he fell sick, unfortunately, under the weather, so he'll be here in spirit. Oh, somebody said I'm here. I thought that was V saying I'm here. Okay. Whitney has produced a remarkable set. At first, the announcement was a book was going to come out called One Nation Under Blackmail. As it turned out, it was 2 volumes of One Nation Under Blackmail. I've got my copy here. I've been reading this thing through for the past week or so. I'm not done yet, admittedly, volume 1.
It's long, so I can't blame you. It takes a while to get through.
It's something. I mean, Whitney, I got to say, going into it, I knew that there was going to be exceptional rigor. I've read your work now for many years. I didn't expect necessarily what hit me, though. And I mean, I've got, and my wife can attest this. I've got pages and pages. These are notes.
Wow.
These are notes,
groovy.
because I'm trying to keep my mind following your mind as you're pioneering trails in the wilderness here, and I'm really doing my best. And you can see I've gone through like whole things of Post-its, like blocks of Post-its. My wall in my study is crazy. I don't know
happens.
how
you should have seen me writing the book. I had I printed stuff off, and I'd ran out of space, so I'd piles of it on the ground, and my daughter would come in and be like, "What's this paper doing here?" She's about to be 5, right? And I'd be like, "Don't touch that. It's there for a reason," even though it just looks like I have paper all over the floor. So, I mean, I probably should have gone with Post-it notes, but you know.
Well, that's something I was asking too. I mean, because I mean, you're essentially going into the question of Epstein and this phenomenon of Epstein. You just scratched on that, and you maybe pulling the thread might be another way of looking at it. And then you just pulled, and then what ended up happening is you essentially recast the entire 20th century, and remapped out a more coherent exposition and mapping of intelligence agencies, their origins, their execution, their purpose, their multi-dimensional nature, since I mean, they're so much different than people think, as well as blackmailing operations, front groups, shell companies, the mafia. Like, you just pulled it all together in such a way. So before we go into it, did you have like a Sherlock Holmes, there's these images of Sherlock Holmes with all these points of connection on a wall? Like, what was your technique to keeping track of all of this material in your mind?
Well, it didn't really develop that way in terms of mapping it out on a wall or physically. It was more like you said, the main thing the thread I was trying to pull on are the Jeffrey Epstein intelligence connections, right? Mm-hmm. And I realized pretty quickly that when you're trying to explain the nature of those intelligence connections to people, most people don't really understand, first of all, how intelligence agencies operate. So for example, people think of the CIA or Mossad or MI5, right? They're monoliths unto themselves. They don't really see these transnational networks. They don't necessarily know the role of CIA fronts and how that sort of facilitates a lot of melding of intelligence and corporate power, the role of organized crime and, financial fraud and financing black budgets and stuff like that. So obviously I had to kind of go back and explain a lot of it. Otherwise, a lot of key aspects of the Epstein story, particularly as it relates to the Epstein connections, don't make sense. And so a lot of the stuff with the early Epstein story, when you go into to that part where he's leaving Bear Stearns and he's sort of entering this world of shadow finance more formally, he's associated with figures that are very much part of the Iran-Contra situation. And I think most Americans in general, and just most people, not just Americans, but in general, either have a very rudimentary understanding of what Iran-Contra was, or like don't really know. Maybe they've heard the term and they don't know what it means. Most Americans, as I understand it, think of it as like the arms for hostage scandal in the Reagan administration. It was really a lot more than that, as people will read the book will find out. It was very extensive and involved illegal financial activity to a significant degree, in drugs trafficking, among other things. And you can't really, and then the more you look at Iran-Contra, it becomes pretty clear that you can't really separate that so much from things like the Promise Software scandal, where you have people like Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, playing a starring role in all of that. So anyway, to explain how Iran-Contra is set up, I ended up going back farther and trying to show that there's all these other sexual blackmail characters that are very much like Epstein, because I wanted to show also that the mainstream narrative is bullshit, that Jeffrey Epstein is an anomaly. American political history especially is just littered with people like him. So eventually I went back far enough and I was like, well, I guess I should explain to people how this all happened. And so I decided to sort of start off from Operation Underworld, but I could have gone back even farther because there's stuff, I sort of talk about like Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano as sort of the guys that teamed up with the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services. But you have like the people that mentored them and, layers of different people that came before them, right? You kind of have to pick a point to start it off. So I figured, that particular point would make sense because, it gave me an opportunity to explain, how the OSS and, the OSS being the precursor to the CIA, how that came into existence, how it's intimately tied up with the oligarchy and also British intelligence in a very significant way, and how that's influenced things over time. One thing I did miss out on that Richard Grove pointed out to me later was the Mayor Lansky's ties to British intelligence back in the 30s and how that may have colored some of the early stuff that I wrote about in the first couple chapters of the book. But, so, I mean, if you're trying to write like 100-year history with like, in less than 2 years with kids and like lockdowns and COVID insanity, you're bound to leave out a thing or two, I guess.
I think we could forgive you for that. And you did allude to it. I mean, because you did, you did it in just getting at the buildup of the Bronfman apparatus and the various interconnected components of that throughout the before the 20s during World War I. Even you did allude to the strange role of Winston Churchill, who just sort of comes in. And obviously you don't unpack it completely, but you did zero in on the role of British intelligence in some higher hand that gave certain key figures that went on to build up this entire crime syndicate good advice, strangely good, insightful advice at the right time. You're like, wait a minute.
It's a completely unbelievable story if you're referring to the Churchill Lewis Rosensteel happened, just by chance vacation. Yeah, that Rosensteel's whole backstory makes no sense. So I didn't try and like read too much into it, because I don't have the answers, but obviously the official story there doesn't really make any sense. And I think it's no coincidence that someone like Lewis Rosensteel, despite his influence at the time, managed to have no biographies written about him. Samuel Bronfman actually almost had no biographies written about him until he was either dying or dead. So apparently during his lifetime, he did not want people to write about him. So I guess Rosensteel was the same. But as far as Churchill goes, I could have expanded more on there and in the role of Britain in that particular period in North America, but then we'd have like a 2,000 page book.
Well, that's for volume 3, I think.
Yeah, no, people keep asking about that. They're like, it should be FTX. So well, this is what I'm saying. I'm like, just give me a small vacation before I start. Because I mean, this was a lot of work. And I do off the bat too want to say that I had a really great researcher help me with a lot of specifically volume 1, which was Ed Berger, who I is in the acknowledges page, and I've tweeted. Well, we've done podcasts together. We're having an investigation actually about FTX come out soon, and some other things.
Right
But
on.
he's a genius, and I could not have definitely could not have put volume 1 together without him.
Cool.
Just don't want
I
to
didn't
take
know.
all
I
the
never heard
credit.
of him.
Yeah, well, he's I kind of found him in a weird way that actually goes back to a weird story about Curtis Yarvin, the guy that's sort of
Yeah,
like
the alt or
the alt-right guy that
yeah,
is a big
yeah.
influencer in Peter Thiel and stuff.
Kind
His
of smells a little bit of
brother,
fascism there.
yeah, his brother Norm Yarvin was like apparently the guy that put a pipe bomb at Yale Law School in the early 2000s and like didn't get in trouble for it and weird stuff. So anyway, we found each other through that story.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so you touched on Operation Underworld. This is something that not that many people are aware of, and obviously this is
Sure.
not the start of it, as you pointed out, but this is a really key jump on point. Could you say a little bit more about Operation Underworld as far as it plays into the broader picture that you paint?
Sure. So, basically what I'm trying to argue in the book really more than anything else is that the power structure of the United States and more broadly, the Anglo-American empire is basically run by organized crime and has been for a long time. And so how did this happen? Well, the easiest point, origin point of that, but you could, like I mentioned earlier, argue that it goes back even before then. Is Operation Underworld, which was when the Office of Naval Intelligence with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, lurking somewhere in the background, teamed up formally with organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, as it was operating in New York City. This was done allegedly to obtain intelligence from dock workers because there was concern about German saboteurs were going to scuttle and destroy ships in New York City harbor. But as I note in the book, there wasn't a lot of actual evidence to that, and it seems to have been a talking point rather somewhat seeded by British intelligence and the media and elsewhere, and sort of created this justification that it was necessary, and it being wartime as well as when wartime necessity, to team up with dock workers in this way. And the dock workers union was controlled by the mob, and so the only way to get to the dock workers was to go through the mob. So that's sort of how it happened. But at this point in history, New York City, it wasn't just the dock workers union that was like owned by the mob. At this point in the 40s, they owned pretty much all of the unions. And had taken control of the Democratic Party in New York because the unions formed a major power base of the Democrats at that point in time. So basically what you have is the ending of the Tammany Hall era in New York. And if people are familiar with that, the reason for its collapse was because of its association with organized crime. So this was sort of the rebranding of the Democratic Party in New York as not necessarily organized crime adjacent, but still run by organized crime. It was sort of like a facelift, but it's the same entities essentially running the show. And so actually the mayor of New York at this time was a guy named William O'Dwyer, who ended up being spirited away to Mexico by Harry Truman. So he couldn't be prosecuted for basically, using his administration as an organized crime racket when he was in charge of New York City. So anyway, that's sort of the backdrop, I guess. So this alliance between organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which is like Mayor Lansky, Lucky Luciano. It's essentially a melding of the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob. This continues significantly over the past several decades and deepens, and eventually, they essentially fuse, and you can't really tell where one ends and the other begins. Right. So a key point, though. But you have Luciano and Lansky sort of at the top of this. But Luciano, during this period in the 40s, is deported to Italy. And he still even after he's deported, is involved with military intelligence to a degree. I don't include a lot of this in the book, by the way. But other intelligence operations, CIA connections and things like that, well, after he establishes himself in Italy. And then it's really Lansky who's left to sort of run it in the US, this criminal empire. Mm-hmm. And a lot of other people tied up with Luciano were deported as well. as part of this whole thing. And a lot of the prosecutors that were involved in this, or the law enforcement officials, were people like Thomas Dewey, who later becomes a business partner of Mayor Lansky.
And that's
And
the governor of New York, right?
he was governor of New York, yeah. But he started off as a prosecutor, one of these tough on crime prosecutors, and then later gets in bed with organized crime. It's the same model that people like, Rudy Giuliani have followed, where they sort of make a big reputation for themselves as putting away these criminals, but they're usually criminals that, the criminals on top want to put away because they're their competition, really. It's about consolidating power
Right.
with these types of guys. So
there's so many angles I kind of want to go in at the same time, so I'm gonna have to. It's tough to like select one.
That's fine.
Maybe yeah. Okay, so just one thought that just entered my mind as you were just talking. Now, I didn't really read this in the book per se, but I'm sure you got a thought on this. Henry Luce, a lot of the a big chunk of the Wall Street establishment in the United States, as well as a big chunk of the establishment in Europe, were pushing for fascism as the great miracle solution. And for the Great Depression, Mussolini was being sold as Times Man of the Year, and this is supposed to be the next big great thing. Did you notice that a lot of these people, like Lucky Luciano and other mobsters at this time, were working to support or help build up the fascist apparatus?
They were very pro Mussolini in the Italian mafia, but also, I guess probably one of the key figures there wasn't necessarily seen as part of the Italian mafia, but was definitely connected. It was a guy named Generoso Pope, who ran basically, he owned the Italian language newspapers in New York City. But he became very wealthy because he ran the main cement company in New York and later nationwide, and that his ability to consolidate control over that particular industry in New York and later nationally was because of his very deep association with organized crime, specifically Frank Costello and figures like that. His son, Generoso Pope Jr., Frank Costello was his actual godfather, which is kind of ironic because Costello is one of the inspirations for the novel and subsequent film, The Godfather. But Generoso Pope, after doing psyops for the CIA, goes and creates the Inquirer, the tabloid. And he's also Roy Cohn's childhood best friend. But it was Generoso Pope, this guy that ran the Italian language newspapers and was very pro Mussolini and heavily promoted Mussolini in his publications, that developed what Roy Cohn would later adopt and call the favor bank system. And it's very interesting to see Generoso Pope Jr. and Roy Cohn talk about how they learned about the politics of power from this particular man, because it was all about backroom deal making, and quid pro quo type stuff. And the way they describe it is really fascinating. I tried to delve into it in the book because ultimately this style of deal making, we see it in Roy Cohn's most famous protege, Donald Trump, the art of the deal and all of that. That he learned that from Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn learned that from Generoso Pope. So there's a direct line from that to a very influential figure in U.S. politics today. But I think it's pretty clear that type of deal making isn't necessarily exclusive to Trump. But one of the things that Cohn adopted from Generoso Pope is something called that Roy Cohn called his favor bank system. So everyone has an open account in the favor bank, and depending on what you do or don't do for Roy Cohn, you get like pluses or minuses, right? And so it's basically leverage over people, a system of managing influence. Really, it's kind of interesting. I wonder how influential that type of system is
it's like
today.
The behaviorist calculus of just
yeah. So anyway, it's interesting in the context when you consider that Roy Cohn himself, as I note in the book, was involved in sexual blackmail activities that involved organized crime and also involved top people in U.S. law enforcement like J. Edgar Hoover. So you definitely end up having leverage over those people just because they're involved in the same thing you are that like no one can know about, right? Because it was like a homoerotic thing. So in that period of U.S. history, you get exposed for being involved in that, your political career is over. And that's why at the same time there was the Red Scare, there was the Lavender Scare. And the main reason behind the Lavender Scare was because they thought that closeted homosexuals were more susceptible to blackmail. But it's kind of ironic when you consider that, a lot of people running the Red Scare, like Roy Cohn and of course Hoover, had involvement in that to an extent as well. They're blackmailing people as part of the Red Scare using, that same, they're doing the blackmailing.
Yeah, it's a
basically.
lot of Freudian projection onto the
Yeah.
system. I mean, but that's one thing you get across too, is that people like Hoover and like Roy Cohn themselves seem to have been the product of blackmail themselves and became almost they became hyper adapted to this, where the victim becomes like
Totally.
sort of
It's
identifies with their abuser.
crazy. Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it. So they're initially entrapped and sort of sucked into this. So they're
Mhm.
blackmailed, and they're like, but then at the same time, they realize the power of blackmail. So in the case of J. Edgar Hoover, he became obsessed with it,
Yeah.
obsessed with blackmailing friend and foe alike, right? But only after well, maybe he was into it before, but by the time he was blackmailed, which was apparently by the mob, he was totally obsessed with it. Though the story of how J. Edgar Hoover was initially blackmailed is very interesting because it shows you this early connection between U.S. intelligence and organized crime. It was originally associates of Mayor Lansky that obtained these pictures of J. Edgar Hoover engaged in oral sex with his longtime deputy, Clyde Tolson. And I mean, that was essentially an open secret in Washington. And now people like laugh about it in Washington, D.C. speeches. Like it's not a conspiracy theory, But anyway, those pictures were shared with James Jesus Angleton, who is like one of the top figures of the early CIA, the big early counterintelligence chief. So, to someone like Angleton, these photos are intelligence, right? So blackmail obtained by the mob is seen by the intelligence community as necessary intelligence. So associating with the mob nets them the benefit of intelligence gathering that affords them leverage over powerful people in the U.S. political system.
Yeah.
And more often than not, the intelligence community, whether in the US or anywhere, I mean, they'll justify all sorts of stuff as long as the justification is either national security or intelligence gathering. And I think actually now in the UK, they passed a law where basically intelligence assets or agents can commit any crime under the sun as long as they're intelligence gathering, right? So
License to kill and then some. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's that seems to be one of the worst components of what the Cold War brought about, was this logic. Not that logic wasn't already employed, but it really became more explicit that anything goes as long as it's in opposition to evil, godless communism. You can work with fascist Nazis. You could kill. You could do whatever you want as long as it's to defend the liberal world order of freedom. And this monstrosity was just created out of this process. And when you have psychopaths or just pathetic characters like Hoover, who's a pathetic character, you can't even call him like, it's hard to categorize people like that. But you have this anecdote of like,
it's very hard to find anything positive about the guy. I'll just put it that way. But I mean, he was blackmailed by organized crime. That's why he never went after organized crime. Look, through Hoover's decades-long career in charge of the FBI, he declined to ever go after organized crime, claimed that it was not an issue.
Well, yeah, even the term organized crime was something he prevented from even entering into the consciousness, right? And you go through a little bit of like how Bobby Kennedy really clashed with Hoover and that apparatus around that specific issue, as well as Cohn and others. Can you say a little bit?
Yeah, Cohn and Hoover both hated Bobby Kennedy, and they were obsessed with destroying him.
Yeah. Which is interesting, right? Because didn't Bobby Kennedy and his brother also get a certain amount of support? I mean, this is one of the things you get, which is, I think, partially true, but I think people often simplify it to the point of lobotomy cases where they're like, oh, but didn't they only become powerful because of their father's mob connections? And people often brush over the fact that no, they were not necessarily creatures of that system. How would you account for people like Bobby Kennedy or his brothers breaking from their what was expected of them and going to battle with this whole crazy apparatus?
I'd probably have to know more than I do about like the educational backgrounds, but as I recall, Joe Kennedy had loads of kids. So, yes, they have their father there, and probably outside of the home, right? That association will help their careers because Joe Kennedy didn't just have mob connections. He accumulated a lot of political power for himself, right?
Right.
So I'm sure that was probably helpful on like CVs and resumes and stuff. for them. But when you have a lot of kids, that's not necessarily like they're exactly everything that the father is being passed on to all of his kids in the same way it would be in like an only child or two child household, maybe. I don't really know a lot about their specific relationship, but it is pretty clear that once Bobby Kennedy and also his brother John F. Kennedy, when they were had political power themselves, they tried to be their own people and they had their own standards, and they didn't really necessarily agree with the way these systems operated that were developing around them at the same time, right? In terms of like this blackmail obsession that like Hoover had. I mean, he tried to go after Bobby Kennedy with anything at his disposal, really, including trying to blackmail congressmen to introduce to ask to hold hearings that would make Bobby Kennedy look bad and stuff. Like Neil Gallagher, I think, is probably the best example of that. And also like weaponizing the press against people, inventing stories, planting it with compliant members of the media to destroy people and stuff. So, I mean, you have people like that. And, I'm not saying Bobby Kennedy never did anything bad. As he apparently was involved with bugging Martin Luther King, right? But it's a complicated world, and I think it's, unless you really study it extensively and how power worked in this particular era, it's kind of hard to understand what it was like. In the case of John F. Kennedy, they tried to sexually blackmail him with the whole Profumo affair network.
Yeah.
After he was elected president, and that didn't seem to work quite well. So there was some sort of power struggle there. And I think, from what I've heard from people that extensively research Kennedy, because that, the John F. Kennedy assassination and backstory to that is like a field in itself to really be specialized and know everything that's in that, which is why I didn't really get into the John F. Kennedy assassination in the book, because it's like people have written entire books just about that one event. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as far as I understand, people thought because he was promiscuous, that would allow him to be easily controlled, right? In the same sense that people make that argument about like Bill Clinton. But I think they have their, very different mentalities there when it comes to responsibility and how they view the office they're holding. I think it's pretty clear that Bill Clinton is like, this is a chance to grift and grift hard. And I don't think Kennedy saw it that way. They can both be promiscuous and have that against them, right? But I think it's ultimately about how you approach the office. And obviously, since Kennedy's assassination, everyone that's held that office has not viewed it the way Kennedy viewed it, or at least has not attempted to exercise that view if they did hold it.
Yeah, they definitely fell short. That's a theme. That's a big theme. And the story of Neil Gallagher as well is something which I'd listened to some interviews of him that he delivered before he died. And he's one of these interesting characters who was not necessarily 100% for what Bobby Kennedy was doing. But as you get through in the book, he wasn't willing to compromise with this whole Hoover cone apparatus, and instead chose to actually resist their at first offers and of rewards and then threats. And he had to go to war, and he won a few little battles, but ultimately
then lost.
Down.
Yeah, he got forced out. And that seems to happen more often than not. And this is back in the 70s, right? I mean, just think about how it is now.
Yeah, he was actually put in prison, and I think there were forged documents, other things as well that were wired in there. So the whole thing is messy. But now we're getting into the 70s. This is, I guess, now a good place to introduce the character. So we haven't really got it at Epstein so much. We've been sort of just painting some of the backstory of some of the apparatuses. Robert Maxwell comes into play, and I don't think you can understand Jeffrey Epstein unless you look at the figure of his little madam creature thing, Ghislaine, and her father, and that whole apparatus that her father brought online and worked with or worked for. Could you say a little bit more about that during that?
All right. Yeah. Well, Robert Maxwell, you could probably just I could have written a whole book just on him. I mean, it's really crazy stuff that he was involved in. So as far as we know, well, first of all, his name isn't really Robert Maxwell. That's a name he adopted at the recommendation of his superior in the British military. He was born in Czechoslovakia, fled, served in the British military in World War II. And then after that, he goes to Britain. He marries a French woman who becomes Betty Maxwell. And, settles in Britain, tries to become a publisher, and expands that over time. He served briefly as a Labour politician, and then lost his seat, and then almost lost his flagship media company, Pergamon Press. And then a few years later, he claws it back and then begins expanding. His biggest expansion period comes in the 1980s. Robert Maxwell, to me, was pretty obviously a narcissist in terms of personality. He was desperate to be bigger than Rupert Murdoch, who would be his main competitor in the media space at that particular point in time. And a lot of his acquisitions were fueled by Rothschild Inc., which is the Wall Street branch of the Rothschild banking dynasty that had been mostly neglected by the family. But then at some time in the early 80s, they decided to get more involved. They wanted to expand their presence in the United States specifically. They hired a man named Robert Peary. They wanted to focus specifically on mergers and acquisitions. And they picked about 3 corporate raiders, all of whom were British, for the bulk of their mergers and acquisitions deals, which were basically planned by Rothschild Inc. But it was, reported in the press that it was, it's Robert Maxwell, it's James Goldsmith. And then the other guy, I can't remember his name, but he's a close associate of Maxwell's. And so, like the Macmillan acquisition, a lot of these other acquisitions in the 80s were planned by this particular bank, right? So at the same time, by the time you get to the 1980s, Robert Maxwell had already been an asset of Israeli intelligence for about 20 years, give or take. And also in the 1980s, he gets involved in a lot of espionage work for Israeli intelligence. So he's he's affiliated with them for longer, but a lot of like his more active collaborations, I don't know. The activities he did at the behest of Israeli intelligence, most of those, at least that we know about, took place in the 1980s. So this is his involvement with arms stuff in Iran-Contra. And then also, perhaps more importantly, from the U.S. perspective, his involvement with the Promise software scandal, where thanks to Henry Kissinger, who's a traitor to America, Robert Maxwell was able to sell software with a backdoor in it. The back door being planted by Israeli intelligence. It was installed at sensitive U.S. nuclear labs, Los Alamos, and I think another one, Sandia, I think. And all of those nuclear secrets were stolen by Israel as a result of that. So, that's part of the Promise software scandal. It's much larger than just the Robert Maxwell component. Basically, most of the intelligence agencies of the world were backdoored by Robert Maxwell and Israeli intelligence. The CIA had a competing version, but it seemed to have focused not necessarily on intelligence agencies like the Israeli one. It focused on banks, which is interesting. They were more interested. Well, according to people that were involved, like Ari Ben Menashe, it was collaborative. So like the CIA was marketing their version on finance, and Israel was doing intelligence agencies around the world, but they were like sharing information, right, between each other. So you have like the World Bank being tapped, and finance flows everywhere. It's tied up with BCCI. It's tied up with drug trafficking and money laundering for the narcotics traffic that was part of Iran-Contra as well. For people familiar with the Mena, Arkansas aspect.
All right, well,
that particular operation. Sorry.
No. I mean, it's so comprehensive, Whitney. I mean,
well, Robert Maxwell had his hand in a lot of pies. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And so this particular stuff we're talking about now, the Iran-Contra Promise stuff, is where you really get into the meat of this power nexus that Epstein steps into, which is U.S. and Israeli intelligence mainly, but with organized crime affiliations for sure. And so the one last point I want to make on Robert Maxwell is that he is credited before his death by the guy who at the time was the top FBI agent in New York, John Patrick O'Neill, who under rather interesting circumstances dies on 9/11. But O'Neill said that Maxwell's real legacy was setting into motion a global coalition of criminals. That Robert Maxwell teamed up, and I write about this in the book too. His business partners were people like Simeon Mogilevich, a Ukrainian-born big-time guy in the Soviet-era mafia, and he allows Mogilevich and a lot of these gangsters in Eastern Europe to establish links. First in the Israeli financial system, he gets them Israeli passports. And then from there they go global, including involving themselves in the US and beyond. And so Robert Maxwell, first and foremost, really fostered this tie between organized crime in Eastern Europe and Israeli intelligence, which I think, have major implications when you look at conflicts today, like Ukraine, for example, which is actually where Mogilevich is from. But on the other side of that, he didn't just create that connection. He combined them with organized crime factions in Europe, in North America, South America, Asia, all over the place, a global coalition of criminals.
Yes.
He, really made organized crime like the power structure, that we're dealing with today to a very significant degree. So again, it's very important, like I said sort of earlier, to focus on the fact that a lot of these structures I'm trying to sort of interrogate and expose in the book are very much transnational in nature. So anyway, it seems like you wanted to go back to Iran-Contra for a bit. So just wanted to squeeze that.
It's like every second sentence, I'm like, oh yeah, gotta unpack that. No.
It's hard. That's why it's a 1,000-page book.
I get it now. And yeah, Robert Maxwell, like you said, I mean, he's in British intelligence, he's in Bulgarian, Eastern European intelligence, he's in Israeli, he's just everywhere. But and sort of taking, I guess, techniques that have already been used for blackmail. And I guess, would you say that the only, and I do want to get back into Iran-Contra, I really do. Would you say that the only reason for these types of operations is blackmail, or is it also partially recruitment, seeing who's got the right stuff to be part of the inside clubs, or how would you describe what the purpose and intention is that Maxwell carried out?
You mean of sex blackmail operations?
Yeah,
or you mean of Robert Okay, so with sex blackmail operations, I think there's like really one of two strategies. So one is that you're getting a lot of leverage over another person. Just by virtue of them being at these illicit gatherings. Yeah. The other one is, and so, there's the strategy where you invite and entrap a powerful person. The other strategy is to have someone who's not powerful, compromise them from the off, and then elevate them into positions of power and have them elected.
Yeah, right. Iran-Contra. All right. So you made a very key point that this is much more important than people realize. In so many ways, and people have a sense of like Ollie North, and like there's certain like very superficial ideas of it. But this was really a moment when something changed within the capabilities within, I guess you could say, the octopus, as you brush upon it in the book. Could you maybe go through a little bit of that and why this is so important? What exactly changed, and what was the purpose of it all?
Right. So I think one of the key points to hammer home about Iran-Contra is one of the key reasons it was set into motion. So basically, Bill Casey, as CIA director, had invested a lot of time and money in building up a support apparatus for the Contras in Nicaragua to dethrone the Sandinistas, who, by the way, had come to power to depose a U.S.-backed dictatorship ran by the Somoza family, I believe. That had been in power for decades and they were not nice. So anyway, the Contras, were supported by the U.S. establishment more broadly, but Congress imposed limitations on Casey, saying now you can only impose humanitarian aid, or you can only send humanitarian aid. You can't send lethal aid. And so because a lot of the support network Casey had been investing time and money in had been paramilitary groups to counter the Sandinistas, like the Contras is sort of the umbrella term for all of these paramilitary groups. He wasn't okay with that. So basically what he tried to do as a result of that was find a way to finance covert operations where he didn't have to go to Congress. So there wouldn't be congressional oversight, or really oversight from any part of the government at all, of intelligence activities. So he wasn't going to go to Congress to ask for money. He was going to finance it by other means. So from the off, Iran-Contra wasn't necessarily about financing or dethroning the Sandinistas. It was about how to make a giant permanent black budget. so that the CIA can conduct covert operations wherever the hell it wants, whether it's financing paramilitaries or doing anything else. It's not necessarily about just Nicaragua and the Contras, right? The Contra situation is what set it off. So what you have as a result of that are finding illicit revenue streams that allow Bill Casey and the CIA to finance these covert operations without congressional approval and thus congressional funding. So as people know probably from, if you're familiar with Iran-Contra, that translates into illicit arms trafficking and illicit drug trafficking and money laundering, really more than anything else. But you could argue that, beyond that, there's obviously other rackets at play here, sex trafficking most likely being a big one as well, but you don't really see it necessarily so much in the Iran-Contra story, though it could very well be there. We just don't know about it. So basically, these types of activities have long been the rackets of organized crime, oddly enough. So you basically have them sort of taking that same model as a way to independently finance themselves. But also, there's been concerns, for example, that, money in more recent decades has just been stolen from taxpayers and sent directly to the black budget, which is probably an evolution of the same strategy that Casey developed. The $2 trillion missing from the Pentagon, for example, that was announced on September 10th, 2001. Where did that go? A lot of people think it probably went to the black budget. And now, Catherine Austin Fitts and Mark Skidmore have calculated that it's about $21 trillion stolen from the Department of Defense and HUD specifically. That's just two, government ministries, departments, right?
Yeah.
So it could probably be a lot more. I think you could really pinpoint that type of decision on the part of the national security state back when this decision was made to not, use the traditional avenues of financing. So again, money's a key part of this. And when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein leaves Bear Stearns under very suspicious circumstances. And there's a Bill Casey connection there that I can unpack in a second. But after he leaves that, he steps into this world of shadow finance, where by his own description in this period, he's either hiding or finding looted money for powerful people. So obviously that means he's intimately involved in the offshore financial system and in illicit money flows. If he's not helping people hide their stolen money, he knows where to find the stolen money. Right. So he has a very intimate working knowledge of, the labyrinthian offshore illegal banking system. And one of his main clients at this time was Adnan Khashoggi, who is one of the people who, with his money, set Iran-Contra actually into motion, at least the Middle Eastern side of that. Adnan Khashoggi's main bank at this time was BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. So if you have Epstein doing your suspect finances and that's your suspect financial institution, that's suggestive of an Epstein BCCI tie. And one of his former business partners, who's now deceased, Steve Hoffenberg, has said that there was an Epstein BCCI connection. And in that same period of time, one of his Epstein's mentors in this period is Douglas Elise, who's an arms dealer, a British arms dealer with alleged British intelligence ties, who's also very close to Khashoggi during the same period. But apparently they were financing not the Iranian side, but the Iraqi side, because this whole thing is about funding and financing both sides of the Iraq-Iranian war. And that's basically what Israel wanted out of it. They wanted both sides, two mutual enemies, to destroy each other. And so the U.S., more or less collaborated in that, because I think they had shared foreign policy goals in that regard. But you have Epstein sort of on that angle of it. So I don't know if you want me to keep going or go back to the Bear Stearns stuff or.
Yeah. It's tough. Okay, so the BCCI thing, for those who don't know as well, like this is something which was just, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was created in like the 70s and it became very quickly one of the biggest banks in the world.
Supposedly because it was a development bank and it was involved in remittances and all of this stuff. It was allegedly, created with the involvement of Pakistani intelligence, but it seems like it was Pakistani intelligence and the CIA, specifically former CIA Director Richard Helms, among others. definitely a very complicated bank. I would argue that it's really more of a private intelligence apparatus than a bank. As I note in the book, they were heavily involved in the sex trafficking of minors. The bank,
Right.
BCCI.
Right. They're supplying like little kids underage to like Saudi
Yeah,
oils
to
and other things.
VIPs of the
Yeah.
bank, including the ruling clans of the United Arab Emirates that were giving them
Yeah.
prepubescent kids from Pakistani villages. And it was the head of BCCI that was doing it, and he had his Ghislaine Maxwell equivalent. Can't remember her name, but she would basically take these kids to the city and get them fancy clothes and jewelry, teach them techniques for whatever, and then send them over there. That's essentially what Ghislaine Maxwell did. So did Epstein and Maxwell get the model for what they did from BCCI? It's possible, or it could have been from someone else. Adnan Khashoggi used his yacht to sexually entrap people. He allegedly had a harem of women there that were used as bait in that sense. And, you know, like I said earlier, I mean, his U.S. political history, especially in these circles, is just littered with people like Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also you had the growth of the Mujahideen, the Operation Cyclone from the CIA, and that whole, like, people are always taught, oh, yeah, terrorism is a natural sociological phenomenon. It just naturally arises when people don't like freedom. And it's like, well, no, when you actually look at the amount of artificial
just the most expensive covert operation in history at that point was necessary to create it.
Yeah. And all of the narcotics flow and everything out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, come on. It's, And that's all like growing at the same time as Iran-Contra as well. Like,
yes. Apparently, you have overlap. Allegedly, Douglas Leese, who I mentioned earlier, was also involved in arming the Mujahideen at that period of time. And since he was mentoring Epstein in this period, which is that mentorship relationship is attested to by his children, and continued their association with between the Leese family and Epstein continued through the decades. Anyway, it's attested to by his sons and stuff. So, I mean, it's very possible that Epstein could have been involved in some Mujahideen arms trafficking to an extent as well.
You were saying that, and there's something I'm going to want to get back to after regarding Microsoft and that whole, because you already like alluded to some connections. I'm not going to say that yet, though. I'm just throwing that out there as a seed for the future.
Yeah, that shit's crazy. Anyway, yeah, I have more to unpack there. I had to order some books. That'll probably be volume 3, if we're honest.
Okay.
Oh, anyway.
I knew it. Okay. Well, yeah, it's one of these journeys, the never-ending story. But there is actually there is a cohesive wholeness to this. There's an end point. I could see that. But the which is we take these assholes down finally, and they finally pay pay the price for their sins. But one thing that I was going to say is, okay, Epstein himself emerges out of this weird, insidious web. He's now tied to a whole variety of things. You mentioned that he was also part of a major Ponzi scheme during this period and maybe into the 90s. Could you say a little bit about like what his role was with that and what was his role in banking a little bit more, Bear Stearns and the Ponzi scheme and could you say a little bit more?
Those are separate periods. So Bear Stearns ends in 1981. He has this very specific murky period of time where he's in this intelligence world with Leese and Khashoggi. That apparently ends in 1987. 1987 is the year that he teams up with Leslie Wexner, though depending on who you believe, they teamed up in 1985. Who really knows the exact year, right? But 1987 is the year that Epstein teams up with Steve Hoffenberg, and together they execute what at that point I believe was the largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Sorry, Hoffenberg, you've been dethroned by FTX now. But anyway, that particular Ponzi scheme was executed by a company that Hoffenberg, I believe, had founded that was called Towers Financial. Douglas Leese was a principal there, and his son, Julian Leese, worked there. So that appears to be the way in which Epstein entered this particular company. Though Epstein himself claims that he was introduced to Hoffenberg by John Mitchell, who was the former attorney general under Nixon. But who knows if that's actually true or not. He doesn't talk in his past interviews. Epstein never brings up Douglas Leese, and because he's like this shady arms dealer, maybe he decided it was best he didn't. I don't know. But anyway, Towers Financial is this massive Ponzi scheme of moving money back and forth and creating the appearance of liquidity when you don't have it. and stealing customer funds to try and acquire this and do that. And it implodes in 1993. And at this same time, he's basically becoming a top financial advisor to Leslie Wexner at the Limited. And by I think the early 1990, he took over as Wexner's money manager, and then a few years after that gets this very far-reaching power of attorney from Wexner, where he's allowed to do whatever he wants with Wexner's money. And has, just pretty much complete control if he wanted it over everything. I think that was 93. Anyway, 93 is also the year the Ponzi scheme at Towers Financial collapses. And at the grand jury proceedings, Hoffenberg is on the stand and names Epstein the mastermind. That's actually the narrative of the grand jury prosecutors. And despite this, Epstein's name is dropped from the case. And in 1993, Epstein makes 3 visits to the Clinton White House. The first one, he's invited, apparently, at least signed in by Robert Rubin, who at that point, I think, was on the National Economic Council or leading that for Clinton. But before 1993, he was head of Goldman Sachs, which, by the way, was one of the chief accomplices of Robert Maxwell's financial crimes, at least that we know about, that unraveled after his death in 1991, like the mirror pension fund scandal. So that's interesting that you have Robert Rubin being the person who's inviting Epstein to the White House. And then after that, you have Jeffrey Epstein being involved in this very suspect fundraiser that's being managed by the First Lady's office, Hillary Clinton, that has to do allegedly with redecorating the White House. But for some reason, you have people intimately involved in BCCI and shadow banking on the list. And it gets a weird mention in Vince Foster's alleged suicide note, which, if you know anything about the Vince Foster story, was fabricated by someone in the First Lady's office, most likely Hillary Clinton herself, and was discovered in the briefcase 36 hours after he died, and 36 hours also after police observed his briefcase being empty and not having a suicide note in it. But anyway, Vince Foster would have been in charge of deciding whether any of those funds with that particular fundraiser were illegal or not. And it's very interesting that the only mention of Hillary Clinton in that suicide note is exonerating her from any funny business with that particular fundraiser that Epstein and Maxwell.
Yeah, in his suicide note, he chose to say, "Oh yeah, Hillary was like on the up and up, by the way, before I died."
Yeah, Hillary definitely did nothing wrong with the fundraiser, is basically what it says. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you think Hillary planted that to exonerate herself, and she actually did the opposite of what the suicide note says, and that means that fundraiser in which Epstein was involved was super suspect. And isn't it interesting that you have a Ponzi schemer, a financial criminal, his name is dropped from a major case, and he gets involved in White House fundraising for the Clintons. And then he has 15 meetings roughly in like almost just a year, more or less, with a guy named Mark Middleton at the White House. And Mark Middleton is a central figure in the 1996 campaign finance scandal for the Clintons' re-election campaign. And then, not to get too much into that, because there's a lot of intrigue and stuff there that takes a very, very long time to unpack. We could possibly do a second interview about that if you're interested when you get through volume 2. But after that, of course, there's the Epstein-Clinton relationship that everyone knows about, where Clinton is going around in Epstein's plane and setting up the Clinton Foundation, which is the political slush fund of the Clinton family, right? So basically, you have Epstein from Ponzi schemer, name drop from the case. He essentially, the way it looks, becomes a financial wizard for the Clinton family.
Right. That and there's also an overlap there, because the Gates Foundation is being created around that same time as
the
well.
Clinton Foundation. That's correct.
Yeah, and that's being then used to fund the Clinton Foundation and the various Clinton Foundation connected initiatives.
There was a lot of cross-pollination between the two, specifically with things like the Clinton Health Access Initiative, which was also set up with a lot of involvement directly from Epstein. Actually, Bill Clinton attested to that, of course, before Epstein was infamous, saying stuff like, "Oh, my whole HIV/AIDS program, Epstein basically told me how to set that up." Right. So that's troubling.
And since
especially,
you
alluded, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, especially since we know that Epstein, even the New York Times and the Guardian will admit, wasn't interested in eugenics. So,
well, there you go. You just said it. I mean, there's this weird intersection with this fixation around types of science or ideas of what biological science is that smells a lot like eugenics, either implicitly or in some cases, like Epstein, explicitly.
Yeah.
in so many points of connection of the things he's funding. And people forget that he wasn't just this. I mean, we're often given, again, a very one-dimensional idea of Epstein as this shadowy figure who had, dirt on a lot of people in power. But
yeah.
he was
Well, the
also
focus in the mainstream media is just on sex trafficking. This guy was involved in a lot more.
Yeah, he was a bankroller for major scientific initiatives in Harvard, MIT.
Yeah. The Harvard relationship is very crazy and also involves Wexner a lot because Wexner basically created the Center for Public Leadership, or the CPL, at Harvard, but started, along with Epstein, funding Harvard in 1991 in connection with Henry Rosofsky, if you're familiar with him, who was a Harvard professor. Who's pretty famous within Harvard lore, I guess. But there was a lot of donations being made by Epstein and Wexner specifically. But the Center for Public Leadership starts getting, its top body gets like stuffed with Epstein associates, people like Leon Black and Glenn Dubin, for example. And they're basically making young global leaders programs. And that was basically the whole arc of Wexner's philanthropy since he created the Wexner Foundation, is training young global leaders, whether it's in the North American Jewish community or the Israeli government, which was the initial focus. But with the CPL at Harvard, it expands to everything. And it actually partners very closely with the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader program. So probably most people in your audience have seen that clip of Klaus Schwab saying, "We penetrate the cabinets," and all of that. That was actually at a forum at the Center for Public Leadership, where he's talking to David Gergen, who's hand-selected by Wexner, the head of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard. Yeah. And if you watch the full thing, not just the clip, if you watch that full forum thing at the beginning, they talk about how extensively they collaborate. And actually, the Young Global Leader program has a summer seminar at the Center for Public Leadership that was the funding for that was facilitated by the Clinton Global Initiative, which Epstein helped set up.
My God, eh?
Fun.
It's too much. It's too much. Yeah, it's so enmeshed. And I mean, you got some strange characters coming in and out of this process too. Yeah. I mean, there's again so many things. Damn. But Lynn Forster to Rothschild.
That's just how it is.
It's okay. No, this is wonderful. It's really but Lynn Forster to Rothschild as well is coming out of this process. Who gets married into one of a Rothschild clan, and she's a high level player in the Council for Inclusive Capitalism today with the World Economic Forum and the Vatican
and the Pope. Yeah.
Yeah, you have all of these points, and she's like part of this whole Epstein weird Wexner operation in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the reasons she's not talked about and why Epstein's relationship with Deutsche Bank is poorly explored is related to her, because she has a long-standing connection with Epstein. Very cozy. It seems to have begun sometime in the 80s. She was allegedly helped by Epstein when she was divorcing Andrew Stein, who oddly enough is tied up with the same Rosensteel Roy Cohn networks in New York that we were talking about earlier. But I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry. Deutsche Bank. Yeah. So she's involved with Deutsche Bank pretty. I think their microfinance consortium and some other stuff. She has a longer standing relationship with Deutsche Bank than Epstein does, because Epstein went from Bear Stearns, right? Bear Stearns collapses in 2008. He goes to JP Morgan. One of Wexner's top business associates who created the New Albany company with him helped pick Jamie Dimon as the head of JP Morgan. So that's probably why Epstein thought it was safe for him. And then after JP Morgan dumps him, he goes to Deutsche Bank. Probably because of Lynn Forrester.
Yeah. So all of these people are all into pushing forth a transhumanist agenda. They're all ideologically into this neo-eugenics stuff. You mentioned, I just want to unpack this a little bit more as we sort of roll out or round out the conversation today. Epstein himself, people are like, no, he's not really a eugenicist. He actually talked about wanting to seed or plant his seed as part of a renewal of humanity or something. And his ranch in was it New Mexico? Is it? Was a center of a lot of controversy for a good reason. Could you say a little bit more about his eugenics thinking and the sorts of things he was promoting in terms of Eric Lander's work in the Human Genome Project and other things that look like science on the surface, but are actually tied to this type of very insidious perversity that he was into.
Yeah, sure. So Epstein was provably very interested in this era of genetics-based medicine, which probably explains his patronage of someone like Eric Lander, whose big claim to fame is the Human Genome Project. But actually, if you look before then, Eric Lander was tied up with this DARPA contractor called Thinking Machines that was all creating supercomputers. And people that were big names at that, like Marvin Minsky and Danny Hillis, are very close Epstein associates. So it may have come through that as well. But the gene-based medicine, I mean, you look basically at Epstein's involvement in the Virgin Islands, and everyone just talks about, oh, Pedo Island, Epstein Island. Yeah, but he was doing a lot more than that in the Virgin Islands. There's like testimony he gave to courts in the Virgin Islands where he's talking about this company he wants to set up, and he basically he describes it as a biomedical Google where you search people's genomes for indicators of disease or problems or whatever. Obviously that is the sales pitch. It's obviously a much more slippery slope. But in order to populate that biomedical Google, he wanted to genomically sequence everyone living in the Virgin Islands, the native islanders, to do that and stuff. So he was very interested in like the mass sequencing of just different populations, which is something that's been done to great extent, specifically now in the COVID era with all the PCR testing, but by companies like Illumina, and I think there's a few others. Of course, the 23andMe, which is tied up with the head of that is married to the Google co-founder that used to eat lunch at Epstein's mansion in New York with a lot of these other big tech guys. Right. So that's the other side of this. So you have basically Epstein being one of those guys who's like in the middle of this merging of big tech and big pharma. He definitely wanted to be in that space from a very early stage. But now you see how that's advanced even without him to a significant degree. And you basically have big pharma and big tech merging with a lot of joint ventures. A good example is Google Health and GlaxoSmithKline making Galvani bioelectronics. Among other examples. So that's the type of medicine that Epstein, of course, is into. And, as your work has shown, John Klezak and others have pointed out that Julian Huxley, when he, is writing out his vision for UNESCO, says we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again about eugenics. And UNESCO is the social cultural organization of the UN. So it's manipulating the socio-cultural milieu to accomplish just that. Making the unthinkable thinkable again. And he basically, roughly 10 years later says, coins transhumanism and it's the new eugenics. Right. So it's about merging man with machine. So once you have these new technologies about genetic manipulation, eugenics stops becoming something about creating, our selective breeding. Right. And who can't breed and what races can't breed and making a master race. It becomes about engineering the master race in vivo, right? Not so much about reproduction. It's about intervention into the human body and manipulating it in vivo or manipulating a fetus or an embryo and all of that. Epstein's very interested in that. And, he wanted to cryogenically freeze his head and his penis so he could like bone people forever. And he's just insane stuff. He wanted to be like Genghis Khan and like just have a bunch of kids and have little Epsteins everywhere but I mean, that's not exclusive to Epstein. Actually, there was an article recently, I think it was in Forbes, talking about all these super wealthy people, how they want to have loads of kids so that the future population is mostly them and not the poor, stupid people.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because these people are always Malthusians as well. They're devoutly religiously Malthusian and want to reduce the world population, but for their particular breeding habits, no, that shouldn't be bounded in any way.
No, they think they're in a different category. It's the rest of us where they're like, God, they keep reproducing like bunnies.
Yeah. Well, that was actually Churchill himself could be a proto-transhumanist, because when confronted with the implications of the Bengal famine that killed 3 million Indians, he was like, they produce like rabbits anyway, kill more of them. I mean, but it's the definition of transhumanism. It's built into the word, right? Like they see themselves as more than human. It's very like Ubermensch. Like,
but like I pointed out in some recent interviews, you have people like H.G. Wells, talking about the bifurcation of that. So you're going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have, the human. You're not going to have the, beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the beyond human and then the subhuman. You're not going to have the b anything in the middle. You either go one way or the other. You go the way the elite are going to go, which is the beyond superhuman, right? Or you go to subhuman, serf,
Morlocks,
permanent worker slave class.
Yeah. Well, it's a disgusting way of thinking. I mean, this misanthropy is so perversely disgusting and pathetic, and it's like they're willing to go to the ends of the earth to try to get humanity and the universe to fit in accordance with their ivory tower notion of what we should be, despite the fact that all evidence we could find for thousands of years demonstrates a totally different characteristic of what humans are, what the universe are, that they refuse to acknowledge. Because I think if they actually began to acknowledge reality as it is instead of as they want it to be, they would have to themselves change, which they're fundamentally incapable, it seems, of willfully doing. I don't see any examples. Maybe you have, but I haven't seen any examples of anybody from that higher echelon of the oligarchical class who willfully became humble and was like, I feel like I've been living my life awry. Maybe there's a couple of examples, but maybe I should change. I can't think of any off the top of my head, though.
Yeah, but I think once you're in those systems, it's sort of like once you're in like these sexual blackmail circles, like if you want to leave, you can't, or they'll just kill you.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I don't know.
What you said about Leslie Wexner, I read one of your little pieces on Leslie Wexner's demons. I found that.
Oh, isn't that crazy? Did you read the article that I got that from, though, in New York Magazine?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
I downloaded it.
It's a trip. It's a trip.
It really is, and I think
it blows your mind, actually, when you consider that this is the guy that has done more to train and finance Israeli government officials and Jewish American leaders in the United States. And it's a guy that openly says that, I'm possessed by a demon. Why does he telegraph that in a nationally read magazine? I don't know. That tells you a lot, though, because why would he want that out there? And it's so bizarre because if you read the article, it like promotes the whole demon thing multiple times. It's like the main theme of the article is that he has this entity living inside him that makes him accumulate more and more power and money. And he has basically a split personality. I mean, it's depending on how you read it, he's either demon possessed or has like a very severe mental disorder where he thinks he's he's possessed, That
was sort of how I was reading it, in terms of like thinking about the disassociated personality type that they were working on in MK Ultra and Tavistock. People like Artie Lang and others were working on this question of how do you fragment the personality. It seems almost like he was exhibiting a lot of the cases when he could even identify when the interviewer asked him, like, what does this look like? And he was like, myself. And
what does the demon look like? It looks like me. Yeah, that's how the article ends. And you're just like, the fuck did I just read? Yeah,
exactly. But it does seem like there's this is like part of the processing of upper level managers, almost, when you think about like what is it that is the experience of somebody going from, maybe quasi-normal, healthy babyhood to becoming something like that, that's been refined over centuries and centuries. It seems to almost be a fragmentation of the self into like this Janus-like pseudo self that you can break off into because I'm like, how do people engage in such perversity that we are encountering regarding not worse than pedophilia, like worse. And actually find pleasure out of that. It's so anti-human. How is that possible? And it's difficult for people to grab their minds around, and it should be difficult to get the mind around how that could be normalized or institutionalized. But it seems like that gave us that Leslie Wexner example gave me at least a sense of how the compartmentalization of the identity into these controlled schizoid outcomes might be cultivated in the upper level managers who maintain the system over the years.
I mean, he's signaling it for some sort of reason, and it's very telling about why he'd be interested in financing a lot of the activities in which Jeffrey Epstein was provably engaged in. And also, I mean, as I note in the book, Leslie Wexner has a longstanding association with organized crime. That's very troubling, and it's amazing he's never been prosecuted, but then again, he's Ohio's richest man. And he basically what I didn't get to talk about when I was talking about Epstein and the White House visits is at that same time, Epstein and Wexner were having the Iran-Contra airline that's provably tied to the CIA, Southern Air Transport, relocate from Miami, where it was doing all this like drugs, arms trafficking between the US and Latin America during Iran-Contra. They relocated to go from Columbus to Hong Kong during that same time that Epstein's having all these meetings with Mark Middleton and stuff. So, you know, if you're like a retail billionaire and you're like, oh yeah, I sell women's clothes and bras and kids' clothes, I need the CIA airline to bring my textiles to Ohio.
Yeah. What's missing from that picture? And Mark Middleton. I mean, just so you mentioned him a couple times already. For those who don't know, he met a bit of a strange fate. More
grisly fate.
Yeah,
in May, just a few months ago.
Yeah. One of the most.
Just as I was writing about him in the book, it was
creepy. Creepy.
Yeah,
one of the most imaginative suicides. He really wanted to die, apparently. I mean, he put himself into it.
Yeah, that he suspended the laws of physics so he could kill himself, basically. Yeah, so if you're interested, people watching, he was found hanging from a tree by the neck, not a rope, an extension cord around his neck, and a shotgun wound to the chest. He killed himself, say local police. But a local court ruled that no photos or videos or any other sort of multimedia from the crime scene are ever allowed to be made public ever.
Yeah, well, that's the responsible thing to do. I mean, traumatic.
His body was found at a property owned by an NGO called Heifer International, which has ties to the Clinton Foundation. We're all surprised by that one. So, yeah.
And we didn't even.
No, I'm never going to Arkansas. I'll just, I have no plans to visit that state ever.
Yeah, and we didn't even get to. I mean, CJ, do you want to? Is there a question from the audience or two that you wanted to throw out? Or Whitney, how much time do you have? I know we're
I can probably take a couple questions, probably 5 to 10 minutes. I should head out.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to at some point maybe schedule, because I think this discussion has just been phenomenal. I'm just sitting here listening in. It's just amazing. Would love to schedule maybe a part 2 discussion at some point, Whitney. I know you're wanting to take some time off here pretty soon, but would love to coordinate that.
I can do it in January or something.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, so we do have a few questions that have been submitted, and maybe we'll just go through just a couple. I know that in terms of speculating or anything like that, but in your opinion, what do you think are the top 4 or 5 groups or factions of people that have emerged through this culture of corruption that's been established domestically here in the U.S. that you mapped out, and now globally? What are those factions do you feel that are out there between the globalists and their battles that are being played out in real time?
Yeah, so that's hard because this group that I'm tracing throughout history have obviously evolved a lot over time. So it's hard to know at any given time, like exactly, I mean, there's a lot of leads I didn't chase down and stuff. So it's possible I missed aspects where there might've been splintering or what have you. But the way it seems to me is that this particular network I'm talking about, which, people like late journalist Danny Casolaro called the octopus and stuff, or what I mentioned earlier, Robert Maxwell's global organized crime network. I think it's fair to say that factions of that operate in every country of the world, at least every country of influence and power, has a faction of that somewhere. And of course, I guess I'd probably, best qualified to speak maybe on factions and in the US right now. I think they both essentially come from this group, the nexus we see in Iran-Contra. You have the Democratic Party, which is Clinton dominated. And of course, the Clintons have ties back to Iran-Contra and a lot of those activities. And their trajectory is pretty clear, and they're, pretty clearly aligned with the globalist agenda, right? And then you have sort of the faction that backs Trump that comes out of that too, but seem to be more like the guys that want a return to the good old days of the Reagan administration, where it's anti-communist and they have their particular brand of nationalism. But I don't think sane nationalists would want any sort of association with them. And I think that's a particular group that backs Trump. But I think they collaborate on more than they disagree on. But as we sort of get closer to this sort of end game, at least for the globalist faction, I think we'll see more, but it's hard to know. Something I found really interesting in the book when I was writing about some of the stuff about Mark Middleton was what's remembered as Chinagate. But I think that's a misnomer. I think it's really more accurately termed Riyadh-gate for Mokhtar Riyadi and his family, which were sort of like the center of this whole thing. That is also known as the campaign finance scandal of 1996. And what you really saw there was, there was a team up of this particular group, the Clinton aspect, a part that splintered off from this Iran-Contra nexus. They team up with components of like the PLA and stuff in China. But it's really with the princelings. So there's some of these like capitalist sons of Communist Party members. And they were, some of them, like the main one that comes up in the scandal, his name was Wang Jun. His father, who was like a very established and important member of the Communist Party, disowned him for being too capitalist, right? So this is a guy that took the connections afforded to him by his family name, got put in charge of a state-owned company, and then used it to get filthy rich. And there were, I don't know how many of these there were, but there were several of them, and they were extensively involved in taking money out of China and, saving it for themselves in the offshore financial system. So, that's just, one example of how transnationalist this really is. And you see it, really all over the place. And so at the end of the day, I think if you want to, trace factions and stuff, you have to sort of have a real handle on the money flows, because that's sort of how you realize where the allegiance of particular players ultimately lies, so right. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot to really pick apart there. That's quite a loaded question, because I think it's particular on the country too, but I think it's fair to say that, the globalists have a lot of influence at this point. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, thank you for that, Whitney. And then just one more, and then Matthew, I'll let you close it out. But
wait, just one little thought on that point.
Good.
Mark Carney did this interesting speech at Jackson Hole in 2019, where he it was like this not so veiled threat to everybody who was allowed to get rich and wealthy over the last decades of globalization and the wild west piracy age.
Yeah.
And he basically said, for those who make the green transition to the new ethos, you will be rewarded handsomely, and for those who fail to make that transition, you will cease to exist. And so it was like a very strong, like heavy threat.
Mark Carney's a good example of how the people in charge today are just the mob. Because like that's something the mob would say.
Right, yeah. But then you get like a lot of people who behaved really terribly and did evil things throughout this like, globalized age. Yeah. And they're also, a lot of them are like, oh, okay, all of that wealth you accumulated in power, it was contingent on a higher objective that doesn't necessarily involve you. And now they're like, what? I'm disposable? What? And so you got this like survivalist sort of impulse from like factions now are kind of realizing they're maybe a bit more flushable than they thought they were. And then you get this anyway.
Well, I think in that faction, the globalist faction, I mean, they're gonna infight among themselves. Just like predators fight over a carcass when they're ripping it apart. They're gonna fight over who's top dog, basically, or who's gonna get to be top dog in the smart dictatorship or whatever. And I think we see that happening and here and there to an extent, and I think it'll just accelerate as things get crazier.
Yep, I completely agree.
Let's hope, anyway.
Yeah. And Whitney, I know we're short of time. You don't have to go into any certain details, but I know you're looking forward to some time off and everything. But potential topics for Volume 3. You alluded maybe to a little bit earlier, but potential topics that would be rolled into volume 3.
Yeah, so I think it would probably this whole like Chinagate thing, and again, I think that's a misnomer because from my research, it's China and Israel together. Well, really, it's Israel as an intermediary helping these corrupt PLA connected companies, which is where you have Epstein and Wexner and that whole orbit come in, and there was just a huge amount of tech transfer from the US, like in terms of sensitive military technology that was being funneled illegally to China and also other places. And a lot of it was also nuclear technology. And Epstein was definitely in the thick of that. And I think if you look at Epstein's connections at that time, he was also very involved with Microsoft and was going on trips to like Microsoft Russia and all of this stuff,
Very
like their official. What's that?
Very significant. Absolutely. Yeah. Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's a bunch of really crazy stuff there because after the book came out, we found stuff about some of the very same people that set up the front companies for a lot of what happened in Iran-Contra, setting up front companies that were part of the same tech transfer apparatus. And a lot of it has to do with the origins of Silicon Valley as we know it today. And I sort of, at the end of volume 2, talk a lot about the Maxwell family and Silicon Valley. And those connections, again, are very significant. And of course, you have Epstein's connection to Silicon Valley, which are equally, if not more significant, really, than the Maxwell ones. So I think, and in that particular thread, I have a lot of my past, not necessarily related to Epstein work sort of coming together, with this Epstein and Maxwell stuff, because, Silicon Valley is about to run our lives, basically, at least they'd like to, and make us our permanent little surf slaves forever. So, it'd be nice to thoroughly expose them. And it seems like this is an opportunity to do that. So
absolutely. Matthew, I'll turn it over to you. Closing thoughts. Bring us home.
Oh, this is a lot to chew on, Whitney. Thank you so much for this feast. And I'm sure everybody is going to buy your books immediately after this interview is done. The links to buying them on Amazon are going to be there in the description box of this video. Once it's up,
yeah, there's also an ebook now, which might be cheaper, especially if you're in a place where shipping prices are exorbitant, which is not the publisher's fault. That's just because shipping companies are charging an insane amount of money to send things printed in the U.S. outside of the U.S. or at least far from the U.S. So consider that, and then also in the next couple months, an audiobook will definitely be out. It's in the works right now. So
good.
Just wanted to let people know about those options. And I believe Trine Day, which is the publisher, TRINEday.com, sells both physical books as a bundle. So if you're in the continental US or Canada, you should be able to get those pretty easily.
Yeah, bypass Amazon if possible. Go straight to Trine Day.
I'd recommend that. Jeff Bezos is like not a good guy. I don't think I have to tell people that, though. I think most people probably know.
Yeah,
I think they're initiated now.
Absolutely.
Well, Whitney, thank you so much for taking the time. And this is I'm looking forward to our next chat in January after we get a chance to read through volume 2. And once again, buy the book, read the book. What are you still listening to us for? Just go and buy the book. All right.
Absolutely. Very good. Whitney, Matt, thank you so much. And for all those tuning in, especially the live chat, thank you for all your added input and everything. So Whitney, thank you. Matt, thank you as well. And enjoy your afternoon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Thanks.